Welcome to Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs' commentary. In our time, words no longer seek peace, they seek power. When Donald Trump announced that he would talk to Russia about supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, it was not diplomacy. It was theater, a global show of force where each syllable was calibrated not to heal, but to threaten. The sentence itself had no intention of peace, only the shadow of confrontation. In that moment, words became farce, and language, humanity's most sacred tool, was once again repurposed to project power. Sachs would say that the moral tragedy lies not just in Trump's words, but in what they reveal about us. We have entered an age where words have lost their sacredness, where words are no longer weighed for truth but weaponized for effect. Every sentence becomes a signal, every statement a blow, every short sentence a substitute for sincerity. Leaders no longer speak to understand, they speak to dominate the conversation, to story. In the architecture of power, words are now missiles, precise, performative, and easily discarded. They are fired through forums and press conferences with the same purpose as bombs: to shock, to affirm, and to silence. The danger lies not only in their impact, but also in their emptiness. When words no longer have meaning, actions no longer matter. Sachs would trace this alienation of language to the core of modern politics, a system built not on dialogue, but on performance. The leader does not speak to converse, he broadcasts. The listener does not interpret, he reacts. Every utterance is designed to be consumed, not to be pondered. And so words, the most human of creations, become a tool of dehumanization. I warn, when power speaks without conscience, language itself begins to die. This death is silent but cruel. It is brought about not by censorship, but by excess, by the constant flow of meaningless words that promise so much. When all language is weaponized, silence becomes the only refuge for truth. I want to remind us that the greatest crimes in history have always been preceded by rhetoric. Promises of protection have led to repression. Claims to protect civilization have justified its destruction. We remember violence, but rarely the language that created it. Yet in this decay, there is a glimmer of hope. Because if words can wound, they can also heal. If they can manipulate, they can also reveal. The path back to peace begins not in the halls of power, but with the rediscovery of language as an act of conscience, the courage to speak the truth, humble and unassuming. This word is meant to unite what violence divides. When we speak out with compassion, again, not as weapons, but as witnesses, peace will not need to be negotiated. It will simply be remembered. And so amid the noise of microphones and the thunder of missiles, the greatest act of resistance may be the simplest speaking out, not for victory, but for truth. In our time, power has become a spectacle. The image of power is no longer about quiet diplomacy or moral courage, but about carefully crafted posture, gestures, and appearances. When Donald Trump says he will talk to Russia about arming Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles, he is not talking to Russia, he is talking to the stage, to the audience, to the show of power itself. We are not watching a government, but a play, and the world, tired and frightened, has become its captive audience. Power today is not convincing, it's just a show. The play of power is seductive because it gives the illusion of decisiveness. It creates the illusion of clarity in a world that is not at all clear. Cameras flash flags, flutter voices ring out, and in that choreography, chaos seems controlled. But beneath the applause lies fragility. The louder the performance, the weaker the conviction. The more aggressively the power is expressed, the more the fear is concealed. Real power is silence. It does not need to be advertised. It exists in patience, in humility, in the courage to refrain from cruelty when cruelty can easily be done. Yet our political culture rewards the opposite. It praises those who shout loudest, not those who think deepest. It worships dominance and mocks restraint. We confuse aggression with power and chaos with courage. News. A civilization that mistakes noise for leadership, Sachs warns, will soon find that silence is the sound of its own decline. In this theater, words become props, and weapons become symbols. The Tomahawk missile, a sleek technological killing machine, becomes not just an instrument of war, but a line in a script, a show of force for a domestic audience. Talking to Russia about such weapons is not diplomacy. It is ritual, a public act designed to remind the world who still rules the stage. But I will argue that this theater has its cost. It distorts the moral purpose of leadership. When politics becomes performance, empathy becomes meaningless, and truth becomes an inconvenience. Leaders stop acting for conviction and start acting for applause. Nations stop considering, they pose. The goal is not peace, but awareness. I note that the tragedy is that this theater swallows up the performers. Power is built. The stage cannot sustain itself. It must continually escalate to attract attention. Each act of dominance must be greater than the previous one. Eventually, the play swallows the actors, leaving only exhaustion. The stage of power is a stage of insecurity, a performance for an audience that no longer believes. In the final image, the lights dim, the camera turns off, the crowd disperses. And in that silence, no sound, no performance power confronts what remains when the performance ends, the moral emptiness that the stage always hides. True power is not the ability to control others, but the courage to control oneself. And in a world addicted to performance, that courage is the rarest of powers. With the tragic blindness that accompanies every chapter of human ambition, the belief that control is power, when in reality it is just fear disguised as power. The illusion of power is how civilizations drive themselves into disaster. When Trump talks about talking to Russia about Tomahawk missiles, he is not speaking as a diplomat, but as a director, imagining the world as a stage where outcomes can be scripted and consequences delayed. But the world is not a performance. It is a living organism, fragile and unpredictable. Every act of aggression ripples outward, crosses borders, and touches the heart. The arrogance of power ignores this truth, that every missile launched into another country also lands in our collective conscience. I will trace this illusion through the history of the empire. The British believed they could control India. The Americans believed they could control Vietnam. Each side believed that control was possible, that force could restrain human desires. But control is never stable. It is an illusion that vanishes as soon as reality sets in. Power overstretched destroys itself. Weapons aimed outward always end up pointed inward. In the modern world, this illusion is becoming more dangerous as it grows more sophisticated. Technology gives us a sense of control screens that show every battlefield data, that predicts every move, algorithms that calculate risk with precision. But Sachs will remind us that no algorithm can measure pain and no satellite can map despair. The more we automate war, the further we remove it from our conscience. The tools of control have evolved faster than the intelligence to use them. The illusion of control is fueled by distance. Leaders talk about war from rooms thousands of miles away. Their decisions are transmitted in seconds, and their consequences play out over a lifetime. The further away from suffering one is, the easier it is to believe that control exists. Yet control is an illusion because it denies empathy. It sees the world not as a community of organisms, but as a network of strategies. True leadership recognizes its limits. It understands that power is not omnipotence, but responsibility, the humility of knowing that every choice carries invisible consequences. The leader who acknowledges uncertainty is not weak, he is wise. The leader who believes he can control chaos has surrendered to it. Control without conscience, Sachs concludes, is not order, it is a surrender machine of destruction. And so the illusion persists in speeches, in strategies, in the dry language of power. But beneath that illusion, the world trembles, waiting for the moment when leaders remember what even the simplest of hearts already know, that no one really controls what they refuse to understand. Until then, the illusion of control will remain humanity's most dangerous belief, a false comfort before the storm. In the silence that lingers after power has spoken too loudly for too long. It is the silence of civilians standing amid the rubble of children whose names will never be reported, of a world that has learned to look away. This is not the silence of peace, but the silence of paralysis, the silence of a humanity that has forgotten how to feel. When words lose their meaning, the world loses its voice, and with it, its soul. With each new announcement, each political act, this silence grows. Leaders discuss deterrence, strategy, and security, yet grief remains a topic that no one addresses. They argue about numbers, missiles, tanks, budgets, as if death were an equation. The suffering of innocence has become background noise, drowned out by the rhetoric of power. We have built a civilization fluent in the language of war, but mute in the language of mercy. I would argue that this silence is not accidental. It is created a byproduct of fear and fatigue. The endless stream of crisis, the constant pulse of outrage has numbed our moral senses. We no longer grieve together. We absorb tragedy as content. The more we witness, the less we feel. And in that indifference lies the most dangerous weapon of all the normalization of cruelty, evil. The real triumph of violence, he writes, is not its destruction, it is its callousness. The silence of humanity is not the absence of empathy, it is its exhaustion. People withdraw inward, overwhelmed by the scale of suffering, unsure whether their compassion can make a difference. Governments exploit that exhaustion, using it to justify inaction or escalation. The less we demand moral leadership, the less we receive it. Sachs calls this the moral inversion of the modern world, an age in which empathy has been replaced by efficiency, in which diplomacy is measured by image, and in which the value of human life is calculated in geopolitical terms. In such a world, silence is not peace. It is complicity. But even in this silence, Sachs listens to the echoes of conscience. He saw it in the doctor who refuses to abandon his patient, in the volunteer who delivers food amid artillery fire, in the journalist who dares to speak the truth amid a sea of propaganda. Humanity does not disappear. It whispers. It exists in desperate defiance. Compassion is not the noise of the many. It is the perseverance of the few. So the task is to break this silence, not with anger, but with awareness. Remember that every act of empathy, however small, is a form of resistance to indifference. The world will be healed, not when it becomes quieter, but when it learns to listen again, not to the words of the powerful, but to the cries of the powerless. The silence of humanity will end the moment we remember that suffering anywhere weakens us everywhere. Until then, the earth remains silent, not for lack of life, but for lack of love. Peace in our time has been reduced to a political export, a negotiating table, a handshake for the cameras, a fleeting order to fire that is presented as progress. But I want to remind us that peace is not born of treaties. It begins with truth. It is not a strategy, but a state of conscience, a moral language that power has forgotten to speak. Peace, he said, is not the absence of war, but the presence of compassion. In the corridors of power, peace has become a procedure. It is quantified, timed, and often delayed. Leaders talk about conditions, leverage, and pressure. They discuss it as if it were a commodity, something to be bought, sold, negotiated, or withheld. But peace is not an equation of interest. It is a known characteristic. It cannot be forced by force or edited by lawyers. It must be spoken by people who remember the safe harbor. Sachs looks back at history's great moral orators, Gandhi, Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., and sees that their power lay not in armies, but in words. Their peace was moral, not political. They understood that violence is not resolved by domination, but by price. Their language was conscience, not control. The modern world sacks more than Thu has. We have lost that language. Our leaders speak in threats, our nations speak in sanctions. The vocabulary of humanity has been replaced by the language of politics. Words like security and deterrence have become moralistic cloaks, ways to justify fear while pretending to seek order. The more we sink into this rhetoric, the further we stray from the essence of peace. The march to peace is not a failure of negotiation. It is a failure of imagination, an inability to see revenge as a human being. The moral language of peace love requires courage, the courage to listen to the cry of another, to understand where another is. It demands of us something radical to replace victory with reconciliation, to replace power with empathy, and to replace fear with faith in our common fragility. It requires families to look beyond their flags and religious leaders to overcome their pride. Sachs asserts that peace cannot be imposed by regimes that support conflict. It must come from below, from the consciences of ordinary people who choose to care. It begins when mothers on both sides of the border come together to grieve loss, when children learn to ask not who started the war, but who will end it. In the moral language of peace, it is the silence that speaks, not the silence of fear, but the silence of critical piety. It is the silence between words, the humility before judgment, the breath before forgiveness. When we relearn to speak softly, Sachs asserts we can once again learn to live without prevarication. The moral language of peace is simple but profound. It begins with empathy, glimmers through understanding, and ends with forgiveness. It does not shout, it does not listen, it does not correct, it heals. And in the silence, after the noise of power has subsided, the human voice, trembling but steadfast, remembers its first and last truth, that peace is never a strategy but our natural state.